Margaret heard the carriage wheels stop outside the gate, and her hands began to shake before she even saw the house. The Hartley estate rose out of the morning fog, like something built to remind visitors of their own smallness. She was 20 years old, wearing a dress that did not belong to her, about to marry a man she had spoken to only twice in her life. Duke Edmund Hartley did not come out to greet her carriage. A steward named Mr. Pratt did that, his face polite but empty, the way a servant's face becomes when he has learned not to show what he thinks. He led her through the entrance hall, past portraits of Hartley ancestors, who all seemed to stare down at her with the same question. Who are you, and why are you here? She knew the answer, even if no one said it aloud. Her family had land the Hartleys wanted, and the Hartleys had a title her father wanted for his grandchildren. It was not a marriage built on love. It was a transaction, dressed in lace and candlelight, and Margaret understood this before she ever said her vows. The wedding itself was small and quiet, held in the estate's private chapel rather than a grand cathedral. Duke Edmund stood beside her in a dark coat, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder for most of the ceremony. When the priest asked him to take her hand, he did, but his grip was brief and formal, like a man signing a contract he had already read twice and had no further questions about. Margaret told herself this was normal. She had heard stories of marriages like this one from other women in her family. Affection could grow later, they said. Duty came first, and love, if it came at all, came quietly, after years, after children, after the two people learned to see each other as more than an arrangement. She held on to that thought because she needed something to hold on to. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Constance Hartley, made her opinion known within the first hour. She was a tall woman, with silver hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her whole face into permanent disapproval. She looked Margaret over the way a merchant looks over a horse, before deciding whether it is worth the price being asked. "You understand your purpose here," Lady Constance said, not as a question. Margaret nodded. She did not trust her voice yet. "Good. Then we will get along, as long as you remember it." The days that followed taught Margaret the shape of her new life. She was given a bedroom far from the Duke's own chambers, in a wing of the house that felt colder than the rest, though she could never explain why. The staff were courteous but distant, trained perhaps by Lady Constance herself to keep a careful space between themselves and the new Duchess. Margaret ate most meals alone. She walked the gardens alone. She read in the library alone, surrounded by books that had belonged to Hartley wives long dead, women whose names she found carved faintly into the margins of old novels, as if they too had once needed to leave some proof that they had existed in this house. Duke Edmund visited her rooms perhaps twice a week, always in the evening, always with the same brief courtesy. He asked how she was settling in. She answered that she was well. He nodded, as though her answer confirmed something he already expected. And then he would speak of other matters entirely: his estate, his tenants, a dispute over a boundary fence with a neighboring landowner. He rarely asked what she thought. When he did, he seemed surprised that she had an opinion at all. She began to notice small things about him that no one else seemed to notice, or perhaps no one else cared to. He worked later than any man needed to. He ate quickly, as though eating were an obligation rather than a pleasure. He kept a portrait of his late father in his study, and sometimes, passing the open door, she saw him standing before it in silence, his jaw tight, his hands folded behind his back like a soldier, awaiting orders from a man who could no longer give them. One evening, 3 weeks into the marriage, Margaret found the courage to ask him a direct question. They were sitting across from each other at a long dining table that made real conversation almost impossible, forcing them to speak louder than either wanted to. "Do you regret this marriage?" she asked. He looked up, startled, as if the question itself was a kind of trespass. "It is not a matter of regret," he said. "It is a matter of necessity. My father's estate needs an heir. Your family has offered stability I could not easily find elsewhere. We are both benefiting from this arrangement. That is not what I asked." He set down his fork. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like exhaustion. "I do not have the luxury of regret, Margaret. Neither do you, if you are honest with yourself." It was the first time he had used her name, and it startled her more than his answer did. She learned quickly that the household ran on rules she had not been told. There was a woman who visited often, a cousin of the Duke's, named Lady Vivian Cole, who arrived with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent her whole life walking these halls. Vivian was beautiful, in the practiced way of women, who understood exactly how their beauty worked on others. And she treated Margaret with a smile, so polite, it barely concealed the contempt underneath. "You must be so overwhelmed," Vivian said during one of her visits, her voice sweet as poured honey. "This house takes years to understand. I grew up half my childhood in these halls. Edmund and I were nearly raised as brother and sister." Margaret smiled back, though the words landed like a small, deliberate wound. "How fortunate you know him so well." "Oh, I do," Vivian said, and something in her eyes made it clear she meant more than friendship. Lady Constance seemed to favor Vivian's company over Margaret's in nearly every gathering, seating her closer to the Duke, praising her wit, asking after her family with a warmth she never extended to Margaret. It did not take Margaret long to understand that her place in this house was not truly hers. She occupied a title, she had not yet earned a home. Still, she refused to let herself become invisible within these walls. She began asking the housekeeper questions about the estate's daily operations, small things at first, how the linens were managed, how the kitchen budgeted its stores for winter. She found that the staff softened toward her the more she showed real interest in their work rather than simply issuing orders. A young maid named Grace Bennet became the first person in the house who spoke to Margaret without the careful distance everyone else kept. Grace was only a year younger than Margaret, quick with her hands and quicker with her opinions, though she kept most of those opinions to herself around the Dowager Duchess. "You should not let Lady Vivian trouble you," Grace whispered one afternoon, while helping Margaret dress for dinner. "She has wanted to be Duchess since she was old enough to want anything at all. It is not your fault she cannot have it." Margaret appreciated the honesty more than she could say. "Does the Duke know how she feels?" Grace hesitated, tightening a ribbon at Margaret's waist. "I could not say what the Duke knows, my lady. He is not a man who lets his thoughts show easily." That much, Margaret had already discovered for herself. Weeks passed into a month, and Margaret began to find small pockets of purpose inside a life that otherwise felt like a performance. She took over correspondence with two of the estate's tenant farms, easing a dispute over grain storage that Mr. Pratt had been too cautious to resolve on his own. She reorganized the household accounts in the western wing, discovering wasted expenses that had gone unnoticed for years. When she brought these improvements to Duke Edmund's attention, he studied the papers she handed him with visible surprise.
"You did this yourself?"
"I did." He looked at her for a long moment, longer than he usually allowed himself. "I did not expect this from you." "You did not expect much from me at all," she said, before she could stop herself. To her surprise, he did not grow angry. Instead, something in his expression eased, just slightly, like a door opening a narrow crack. "No," he admitted, "I did not. I am beginning to think that was a mistake." It was a small moment, barely a sentence, but Margaret held on to it, the way a person holds on to warmth on a cold night. She told herself it meant something. She told herself that perhaps, in time, this house could become more than a cage dressed in fine furniture. She did not yet know how quickly that hope would be tested, or how many people in this house had already decided, long before she arrived, that she would never truly belong. That night, walking past the drawing room on her way to bed, she heard Lady Constance's voice through the half-open door, low and sharp, speaking to Vivian, in a tone meant for no one else's ears. "She is clever. I will grant her that," Lady Constance said. "But clever women are the most dangerous kind if they are allowed to stay too long." Margaret stopped in the hallway, her heart suddenly loud in her own chest. "She will not stay long," Vivian answered, and there was something in her voice, calm and certain, that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Not once she has given him what he needs." Margaret did not move for a long moment after the voices faded into other topics. She stood in the dim hallway, the candle in her hand trembling slightly, and understood, for the first time with total clarity, that she was not simply overlooked in this house. She was being measured for how long she would be needed, and by whom, and for what purpose. She walked back to her cold room that night, and did not sleep until the sky had already begun to lighten, turning Vivian's words over and over in her mind, searching for a way to protect herself from a danger she could not yet name. She decided, lying awake, that she would not simply wait to see what came. If this house intended to use her and discard her once her purpose was served, she would make herself impossible to discard easily. She would learn every corner of this estate, every ledger, every alliance, every weakness, so that whatever came next, she would not face it as a stranger in someone else's house. She would face it as a woman who understood exactly where she stood and exactly what she was worth. It was a small decision, made in the dark, by a woman who did not yet know how much she would need that strength in the months ahead. But it was the first true choice she had made since arriving at Hartley Estate, and it would prove, in time, to be the choice that saved her. The morning brought no answers, only the same routines, dressed in the same silence, but Margaret walked through them differently now. She watched more closely, she listened more carefully, and somewhere deep inside her, a quiet resolve had begun to take root, one that no dowager duchess, no scheming cousin, and no distant husband would be able to easily uproot. 2 months into her marriage, the physician confirmed what Margaret had already begun to suspect on her own. She was carrying the Duke's child. Lady Constance received the news with something close to genuine warmth, the first Margaret had seen from her. Even Vivian's smile at dinner that evening seemed to carry a new caution behind it, as though a piece on the board had shifted in a direction she had not fully prepared for. Duke Edmund, when Margaret told him privately in his study, set down his pen and looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "An heir," he said, almost to himself. "Yes. You have done well, Margaret." It was meant as praise, she understood that, but the words landed strangely, as though her worth had just been confirmed, rather than her joy acknowledged. Still, she chose to focus on the warmth in his eyes, rather than the coldness of his phrasing, because for the first time since her wedding day, he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he is beginning, however slowly, to see. In the months that followed, something did shift between them. Duke Edmund began visiting her rooms more often, not only in the evenings but sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, bringing small excuses with him, a question about the tenant accounts, a book he thought she might enjoy. He asked after her health without being prompted. Once, walking together through the eastern garden, he reached out and steadied her arm when her foot caught on a loose stone, and he did not let go for several steps afterward, longer than necessary, as though he had simply forgotten to release her. "You seem different lately," Margaret said one evening, as they sat together by the fire, an unusual closeness for them. "Do I? You smile more, or at least, you frown less." He laughed, quietly, but it was real. "Perhaps I am only now beginning to understand what I have in this marriage." Margaret held those words close, in the weeks that followed, turning them over like a small treasure she was afraid to lose. She allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. She imagined a future where this house became warm instead of cold, where her child grew up surrounded by two parents who had learned, in their own slow and imperfect way, to care for one another. But hope in that house was a fragile thing, and Vivian Cole had never stopped watching. Margaret noticed Vivian's visits growing more frequent as her pregnancy progressed, though the reasons given were always innocent enough. A concern for Margaret's health, a gift for the coming child, a desire to spend time with dear cousin Edmund before the household grew busier with a new arrival. Lady Constance welcomed each visit warmly, seating Vivian beside the Duke at every dinner, encouraging long conversations between them that stretched late into the evening, while Margaret, growing heavier and more tired with each passing month, excused herself early. "You should rest," Duke Edmund told her one such evening, though Margaret could not help noticing he did not rise to walk her to her rooms, choosing instead to remain at the table, deep in conversation with his cousin. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself Vivian was simply family, and the closeness between them was old and harmless, the kind that existed between people who had grown up together and had nothing romantic left to prove. She told herself this, even as a small, persistent doubt began to settle in her chest, one she could not fully silence no matter how she tried. Grace Bennet, ever loyal, grew more careful with her words as the months passed, but Margaret could see the concern in her face whenever Vivian's name came up. "You needn't worry over gossip," Grace said one afternoon, though her tone suggested otherwise. "The Duke married you. Whatever closeness exists between him and Lady Vivian, it is not enough to undo a marriage." "But is it enough to undo affection?" Margaret asked quietly. Grace did not answer, and her silence said more than words could have. The final months of Margaret's pregnancy were difficult, filled with long, restless nights, and a body that no longer felt entirely her own. She found comfort in small things, the sound of birds in the garden each morning, letters from her own family expressing joy over the coming grandchild, the quiet company of Grace, who never once made her feel like a burden. She found less comfort in the increasing distance she sensed from her husband, who grew more consumed by matters of the estate as her due date approached, leaving her more often in the company of Lady Constance, whose warmth toward her had cooled again now that the initial excitement of the pregnancy had settled into routine. The child came on a stormy night in early spring. Margaret labored for nearly 14 hours, the physician and 2 experienced midwives working through the long hours as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled over the estate like something enormous and impatient. She remembered very little of the pain itself in later years, only fragments, the physician's calm voice instructing her, Grace's hand gripping hers tightly through the worst of it, and finally, near dawn, the sound of a child's first cry cutting through the storm. A son. They placed him in her arms, small and red-faced, and furious at having been born into such a loud world, and Margaret felt something inside her chest crack open entirely, a love so immediate and overwhelming that every hardship of the past months seemed suddenly worth it. She named him William, after her own grandfather, and Duke Edmund, when he finally entered the room, stood over the cradle for a long time in silence, his expression something Margaret had never seen on him before, unguarded, almost fragile. "He has your eyes," he said finally. "He has your chin," Margaret answered, smiling despite her exhaustion. For a brief, shining moment, standing together over their sleeping son, Margaret allowed herself to believe that everything difficult about this marriage had finally begun to resolve itself. She believed the cold distance of the early months had simply been the growing pains of 2 strangers learning to become a family. She believed the whispers she had overheard, the careful glances from Lady Constance, the too familiar warmth between Edmund and Vivian, were all things that would fade now that William had arrived, now that the estate finally had what it needed, now that she had proven, beyond any doubt, that she belonged in this house. She was wrong, though she would not understand how wrong, for several more weeks. The trouble began quietly, the way trouble in that house always seemed to begin. Margaret was still recovering from the birth, spending most of her days resting with William in the nursery, when she began to notice small changes in the household's behavior toward her. The servants who had grown warmer during her pregnancy grew careful again, their eyes sliding away from hers in the hallways. Lady Constance's visits to the nursery, once frequent, became infrequent, and when she did visit, her attention seemed focused entirely on William, as though Margaret herself had become invisible now that her purpose had been fulfilled. Vivian's visits, meanwhile, increased. She came almost daily, always with some excuse involving the baby, a gift, a piece of advice, a story about her own younger cousins. She spent long hours in conversation with Duke Edmund in his study, hours that stretched well into the evening, and Margaret, still weak from childbirth and consumed with caring for William, found she no longer had the strength to question it the way she once might have. It was Grace who first brought her the whispers circulating below stairs, whispers Margaret would later understand had been carefully planted rather than naturally grown. "There is talk," Grace said one evening, her voice low, her eyes darting toward the nursery door, as though afraid of being overheard even there. "Talk about the birth itself, about whether the child came too early to be entirely certain." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying nothing, my lady. I am only telling you what is being said, because I think you deserve to know before it reaches ears that matter more than mine." Margaret sat very still, William asleep in her arms, and felt the fragile peace of the past weeks begin to crack beneath her, like ice too thin to hold any real weight. She did not yet know who had started such a rumor, or why, though a name rose immediately to her mind, one she had trusted less and less with every passing week. She would not have long to wait before she found out exactly how far that rumor, and the woman behind it, intended to go. The accusation, when it finally came, arrived not as a whisper, but as a formal charge, delivered by Lady Constance herself in the drawing room, with Duke Edmund seated silently beside her, and Vivian standing near the window, her expression arranged into something that resembled sympathy, but felt, to Margaret, like triumph barely restrained. "There are questions," Lady Constance said, her voice cold and measured, "about the timing of William's birth. Questions about whether he was truly conceived within this marriage, or before it began." Margaret stood frozen, William asleep in the nursery upstairs, unaware that his very existence was being weighed and questioned, in a room he would never remember. "That is a lie," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You know it is a lie." "I know only what has been brought to my attention," Lady Constance said. "A servant who claims to have seen you with a man before your marriage, a timeline that does not sit comfortably with the physician's account of the child's birth. These are not accusations I have invented, Margaret. They are questions that must be answered, for the sake of the Hartley name." Margaret turned to her husband, searching his face for the man who had stood over William's cradle weeks earlier, and called him, however briefly, his son with unguarded tenderness. "Edmund, you cannot believe this." He would not meet her eyes. "I do not know what to believe," he said quietly, "but I cannot ignore accusations of this nature, not when the succession of this house depends on certainty. And what of what I say? What of my own word?" "Your word," Lady Constance interjected smoothly, "is precisely what is in question." Margaret looked between them, her husband's silence, his mother's cold composure, Vivian's carefully arranged sympathy near the window, and understood, with a clarity that felt like ice spreading through her chest, that this had never truly been about the truth. It had been decided long before this conversation, in whispered discussions she had not been present for, by people who had wanted her gone from the moment she gave this house what it needed, and nothing more remained for her to offer that they valued. "I want to speak with the servant who made this claim," Margaret said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I want to know their name. I want to defend myself properly, before a fair hearing, not simply be accused in a drawing room and expected to accept it." "There will be an investigation," Lady Constance said, in a tone that made clear the outcome had already been decided, regardless of what any investigation uncovered. "Until it concludes, it is best for the household, and for young William, that you remove yourself to the dower cottage on the northern edge of the estate. You are separating me from my son." "Temporarily," Lady Constance said, though there was nothing in her voice that suggested temporary meant what the word should mean. Margaret turned once more to Edmund, her last hope, the man who had once steadied her arm in the garden and lingered longer than necessary. "Please," she said, her voice breaking for the first time, "do not let them do this." He looked at her then, and for one brief moment, she saw something that might have been regret flicker across his face. But whatever conflict lived behind his eyes, he did not act on it. He said nothing. He simply looked away, toward the window, toward Vivian, who stood watching the entire exchange with an expression Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. Calm, patient, and utterly without remorse. She was given 1 hour to gather her belongings. She was not permitted to see William before she left, told only that the child needed rest, and that a prolonged farewell would upset him unnecessarily. Grace helped her pack in tears, whispering apologies that were not hers to give, promising to care for William in whatever small way the household would allow her. "I will write to you," Grace promised. "Whatever happens, I will find a way to send word." Margaret left the estate that evening, in a small, plain carriage, the same estate she had entered 11 months earlier, as a nervous bride full of cautious hope. She looked back once, through the small carriage window, at the house rising cold and enormous against the darkening sky, and thought of her son sleeping somewhere inside its walls, growing up believing, perhaps, that his mother had abandoned him rather than been torn away. The dower cottage was small, cold, and isolated, tucked at the edge of the estate's northern boundary, far enough from the main house that no sound of daily life reached it, close enough that Margaret could sometimes see smoke rising from the manor's many chimneys, and imagine, with an ache that never fully faded, what was happening inside those walls without her. The investigation Lady Constance had promised never truly happened, not in any form that gave Margaret a chance to defend herself. Instead, over the following weeks, she received only cold, formal correspondence, delivered by Mr. Pratt, informing her that the family's solicitors had determined, based on evidence they did not share with her directly, that the marriage would be annulled on grounds of deception regarding the timing of her pregnancy. She was offered a modest sum, delivered with the clear expectation that she would leave the region entirely and make no further claim on the Hartley name, the estate, or her son. She refused to sign the papers at first, writing desperate letters to Duke Edmund that went unanswered, writing to her own family, who responded with sympathy but little practical power to challenge a duke's household on legal grounds. She wrote to Grace, who wrote back in secret, describing a household that had settled quickly and comfortably into its new arrangement. Lady Vivian, now a constant presence at Edmund's side. William, growing without any awareness that the woman caring for him now was not the mother who had carried him. The final blow came nearly 2 months after her removal from the estate, when Mr. Pratt arrived at the cottage with papers she had no real power to refuse. The annulment had been finalized. Her marriage no longer existed in the eyes of the law. Her son, under the terms of the Hartley family's private arrangement, remained the Duke's heir, raised within the estate, with no legal claim remaining to the woman who had given birth to him. Margaret signed the papers with a hand that did not feel entirely her own, understanding, in that moment, that she had lost everything the world considered to define her: a husband, a title, a home, and worst of all, a son she had held for only a few precious weeks before he was taken from her arms. She left the dower cottage the following morning with a single trunk of belongings and the small sum of money the Hartleys had offered as the price of her silence. She did not know, standing at the edge of the estate's boundary and looking back one final time at the distant house, that she would return to these grounds again one day, not as a discarded duchess begging for mercy, but as a woman the entire county would learn to fear and respect in equal measure. She knew only, in that dark and grieving moment, that she had survived something meant to destroy her, and that survival, however painful, was the only foundation she had left to build upon. The city Margaret settled in was nothing like the quiet countryside surrounding Hartley Estate. It was loud, crowded, and indifferent to who she had once been, which suited her perfectly. No one here knew the name Duchess of Hartley. No one whispered about scandal or annulment when she walked down the street. She was simply a woman alone, trying to survive on a sum of money that would not last forever if she did not find a way to make it grow. She took a small room above a dressmaker's shop, paying for it with the last of her formal jewelry, pieces the Hartleys had allowed her to keep only because they were too minor to be worth reclaiming. The dressmaker, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Talbot, noticed quickly that Margaret had an eye for fine detail and an understanding of fabric and fit that went beyond what most customers possessed. "You have worked with fine cloth before," Mrs. Talbot observed one afternoon, watching Margaret adjust the drape of a gown on a mannequin without being asked. "I have worn a great deal of it," Margaret answered carefully, offering nothing more. Mrs. Talbot did not press for details, but she did offer Margaret a position, first as a seamstress, then, within a few months, as someone who helped manage the shop's growing list of wealthy clients. Margaret discovered, to her own quiet surprise, that she had a genuine talent for this work, an eye for what flattered a particular figure, a patience for difficult customers that came easily to a woman who had survived far worse difficulties than an indecisive client choosing between 2 shades of blue. She threw herself into the work, not only because she needed the income, but because it gave her something she had been denied in the Hartley household: purpose that belonged entirely to her, unearned by marriage or birth, built instead by her own 2 hands. Word of her skill spread slowly at first, then more quickly, as the wives of merchants and minor gentry began requesting her specifically, drawn by gowns that fit better and looked finer than anything else available in the city. Within 2 years, Margaret had saved enough to open a small shop of her own, modest but respectable, tucked on a quiet street, favored by exactly the kind of clientele who could afford to pay well for quality. She did not forget William, not for a single day. Grace's letters continued to arrive, less frequently as the distance between their lives grew, but faithfully enough that Margaret always knew, in broad strokes, how her son was growing. He was healthy. He was clever, according to Grace, quick with numbers, and quicker still with questions that occasionally troubled his tutors. He believed, as far as Grace could tell, that his mother had died shortly after his birth, a story Lady Constance had apparently decided was simpler than the truth. Margaret wept reading that particular letter, alone in the small room above her shop, grieving a version of her death that had never actually happened, grieving a son who believed her, gone from the world entirely, rather than simply gone from his life. But grief, she had learned, could not be allowed to consume every hour of every day, not if she intended to survive, and increasingly, not if she intended to eventually return. It was nearly 3 years after leaving the Hartley estate that Margaret's path crossed with a man who would change the direction of her rebuilding entirely. His name was Mr. Whitmore, a solicitor who visited her shop on behalf of a client seeking a gown for his daughter's presentation into society. He was older, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the kind of quiet, careful intelligence that Margaret had learned to recognize and respect. Over several visits, as he returned to check on the gown's progress, their conversations drifted beyond fabric and fittings into broader topics: business, law, the particular vulnerabilities of women whose reputations had been damaged by powerful families with more resources than scruples. Margaret did not tell him her full story at first, but something in the careful way she spoke about such matters must have revealed more than she intended, because one afternoon he set down his tea and looked at her directly. "You are not simply a dressmaker with strong opinions about the law," he said. "I have handled enough cases involving powerful families and discarded wives to recognize the particular kind of caution you carry." Margaret considered denying it, out of old habit, the same instinct that had kept her quiet and careful since leaving Hartley estate. But something about Mr. Whitmore's steady, unbothered manner made her decide, for the first time in 3 years, to tell someone the entire truth. She told him everything: the marriage, the birth, the accusation that had never been properly investigated, the annulment forced upon her without a fair hearing, the son she had not seen in 3 years, growing up believing his mother had died rather than been discarded. Mr. Whitmore listened without interruption, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "An annulment obtained through unproven accusation, without a proper hearing, denying you the right to respond formally to the charges against you," he said slowly, "is not necessarily as final as the Hartley family would like you to believe." Margaret felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, a small, cautious flicker of hope. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that if the servant who accused you can be found, and if that servant's testimony can be shown to be false or coerced, there may be grounds to challenge the annulment entirely. It would not be simple. The Hartleys have wealth and influence that would fight such a challenge fiercely, but it would not be impossible either, particularly if we can establish who benefited most from your removal, and why." Margaret thought immediately of Vivian's calm, patient expression the day of her accusation, of the careful way Lady Constance had orchestrated every step of her removal without ever allowing Margaret a genuine chance to defend herself. "I know exactly who benefited," she said quietly. "I have known for 3 years." Over the following months, Mr. Whitmore, with Margaret's careful assistance, began the slow, patient work of building a case few believed could succeed. He tracked down the servant whose testimony had supposedly proven Margaret's deception, a young man who, once found and questioned away from the influence of the Hartley household, admitted, with visible shame, that he had been paid a significant sum to provide false testimony, arranged through an intermediary he had never directly connected to Lady Vivian, though the pattern of payment traced back, through careful legal work, to funds drawn from an account she controlled. It was not, on its own, enough to overturn a legal annulment immediately. But it was enough, Mr. Whitmore assured her, to force a genuine hearing, one the Hartley family would find very difficult to avoid, without appearing to have something to hide. Margaret's shop continued to grow throughout this period, giving her not only the income needed to fund such a lengthy legal effort, but also something equally important: standing. She was no longer an anonymous, discarded woman easily dismissed. She was a respected businesswoman, with connections among the very social circles that mattered to families like the Hartleys, women who wore her gowns to the same events where the Hartley name still carried weight, women who, upon hearing pieces of her story over the years, had grown quietly sympathetic to a woman so clearly capable and so clearly wronged. The news that finally pulled Margaret back toward Hartley estate arrived not through Mr. Whitmore's careful legal channels, but through a hurried, worried letter from Grace, delivered nearly 4 years after Margaret had left the estate in that small, plain carriage. William was ill, A fever that had settled into his lungs and refused to break, worrying the physicians enough that Grace had taken the risk of writing to Margaret directly, believing, as she put it, that a mother deserved to know regardless of what the law claimed about her rights. Margaret read the letter standing in the middle of her own shop, surrounded by fine fabric and the life she had built entirely on her own, and understood, in that single instant, that whatever careful legal strategy Mr. Whitmore had been building toward a slower, more deliberate confrontation no longer mattered as much as it had the day before. Her son was ill, her son might be dying, and whatever the law said about her rights, no piece of paper could stop her from going to him. She left for Hartley Estate within the day. Margaret arrived at the Hartley Estate on a gray afternoon that felt, to her, strangely similar to the morning she had first arrived, as a nervous young bride nearly 4 years earlier. The house looked the same, cold and enormous, though something about it now felt smaller to her eyes, less intimidating than it once had been. She was no longer the frightened girl who had walked through these doors for the first time, uncertain of her place in the world. She had built a life since then, entirely her own, and she carried that strength with her as she stepped down from the carriage and walked toward the entrance, without waiting to be invited inside. Mr. Pratt answered the door himself, and his face, upon seeing her, went through several emotions in quick succession: shock, uncertainty, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. "My lady," he said, the old title slipping out before he seemed to remember it, no longer legally applied. "I did not expect—"
I am here for my son,"
Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. "Grace wrote to me. I understand he is unwell." Mr. Pratt hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let her in, a small act of quiet loyalty that told Margaret everything she needed to know about where his sympathies had truly lain all along. The house had changed little in 4 years, though it felt different walking through it now, no longer as a resident, but as a visitor, with a purpose that could not be denied. She moved quickly toward the nursery wing, guided by memory and by the sound, growing louder as she approached, of a child's labored coughing. She found Grace first, standing outside the nursery door, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. Grace's expression broke into something close to tears at the sight of her. "You came," Grace whispered. "I was not certain the letter would reach you in time, or that you would risk coming even if it did." "Nothing could have stopped me," Margaret said. "How is he?" "The physicians are inside now. The fever will not break. Lady Constance has sent for a specialist from the city, but he will not arrive until tomorrow at the earliest. And Grace—" She stopped herself, glancing nervously toward the door. "You should know, the Duke does not yet know I sent for you." Before Margaret could respond, the nursery door opened, and Duke Edmund stepped out, his face drawn with exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested he had not slept properly in days. He froze at the sight of Margaret standing in the hallway, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke at all. "Margaret," he said finally, her name coming out rough, disbelieving. "I am here for William," she said, refusing to let old grief or old anger distract her from the only thing that mattered in that moment. "Whatever else stands between us, whatever the law says I am no longer entitled to, I am still his mother, and I will not stand outside this door while he suffers." She expected argument. She expected, perhaps, the same silence that had failed her 4 years earlier, the same unwillingness to choose her over the comfortable arrangement his family had built in her absence. Instead, Duke Edmund stepped aside from the nursery door, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. "Please," he said, "help him. I do not care what anyone in this house says about it. Help our son." Margaret moved past him into the nursery, where William lay small and flushed against his pillows, his breathing shallow and uneven, his small face pale beneath damp curls that reminded her, with an ache that nearly stole her breath, of the newborn she had held only briefly before he was taken from her. She sat beside his bed immediately, taking his small hot hand in her own, and though he did not know her, though he had been raised to believe his mother had died before he could ever remember her face, something in him seemed to settle at her touch, his breathing easing, however slightly, as though some part of him recognized, even without memory, the voice that began speaking softly beside him, telling him he was not alone, that he would be well, that someone who loved him very much had come and did not intend to leave. Margaret did not leave William's bedside for 3 days. She worked alongside the physicians, insisting on changes to his care, that her own years of running a business, of learning patience and precision under pressure, had taught her to advocate for firmly and without apology. She cooled his fever with damp cloths through the long hours of the night. She sang to him quietly when his breathing grew ragged with distress. Old songs she remembered from her own childhood, songs she had never had the chance to sing to him before. Grace stayed close throughout, bringing food Margaret rarely remembered to eat, standing guard against Lady Constance's occasional attempts to enter the nursery and reassert control over a situation that had, for the first time in 4 years, slipped entirely out of her hands. Duke Edmund remained nearby as well, though he kept a careful distance from the bed itself, watching from the doorway or a chair in the corner, his exhaustion and worry plain on his face. On the second night, as Margaret finally allowed herself a brief rest in a chair beside the bed, he approached quietly and sat across from her, the two of them separated only by their sleeping son. "I never believed the accusation," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not truly, not in my heart. But I was weak, Margaret. I let my mother's certainty and my own fear of scandal decide what I should have decided for myself. I have regretted it every single day since you left this house." Margaret studied his face in the dim candlelight, searching for the same coldness she remembered from their wedding day, and finding instead something worn and genuinely remorseful, though she was careful not to let old hope overwhelm the caution she had spent 4 years building. "Regret does not undo what was done," she said quietly. "It does not give me back 4 years with my son. It does not undo the humiliation, or the lies, or the fact that you let them happen, without ever once truly fighting for me. I know," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive it easily, or quickly. I am only telling you the truth, because I owe you at least that much, after everything I failed to give you before." William's fever broke on the third night, the crisis passing quietly sometime near dawn, his breathing finally easing into the slow, steady rhythm of true rest rather than desperate struggle. The physicians, arriving to check on him that morning, pronounced him out of danger, though they cautioned that his recovery would still require weeks of careful care. Margaret wept quietly at his bedside when the physicians confirmed he would live, exhaustion and relief overwhelming her all at once. After 3 days of fear, she had refused to fully acknowledge until the danger had finally passed. It was in the days that followed, as William slowly began to recover, laughing weakly at Margaret's stories, asking, with the innocent curiosity of a child too young to understand the complicated grief adults carried, who this woman was who stayed by his bed and sang him songs he somehow felt he already knew. That the truth of Margaret's identity as his mother finally had to be addressed, not only to William himself, but to the entire household that had spent 4 years believing, or pretending to believe, a story built entirely on lies. Lady Constance did not take the truth's return gracefully. She confronted Margaret in the drawing room on the 5th day, her composure cracking for the first time since Margaret had known her, real anger replacing the cold, controlled disapproval that had once defined every interaction between them. "You cannot simply return here and undo everything that was arranged," Lady Constance said sharply. "There are legal realities you cannot wish away with a mother's tears at a sickbed." "I am aware of the legal realities," Margaret answered, her voice calm, despite the anger simmering beneath it. "I have spent 4 years working with a solicitor who understands them far better than either of us. I did not come here only to sit at William's bedside, Lady Constance. I came because I intend to prove, with evidence, exactly how this family orchestrated my removal, and exactly who benefited from it." Something flickered across Lady Constance's face, the first genuine flicker of uncertainty Margaret had ever seen there. "What evidence?" "A servant who was paid to lie about the timing of my pregnancy. Payments traced back to an account controlled by your niece. A pattern of deliberate deception designed to remove me from this house the moment my usefulness had been served." Margaret held her gaze steadily. "Mr. Whitmore has been building this case for nearly a year. I did not come here only to heal my son, Lady Constance. I came here to finally be heard, after being denied that right 4 years ago." Lady Vivian, who had entered the room partway through this exchange, went very pale, her earlier composure crumbling entirely under Margaret's steady, unflinching gaze. "This is absurd," Vivian said, though her voice lacked its usual confident polish. "You cannot prove such accusations." I already have, Margaret said quietly. The only question remaining is whether this family wishes to settle the matter privately, with dignity, or whether you would prefer it settled publicly, in front of every solicitor, judge, and society gossip in the city. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, broken only when Duke Edmund, who had entered the room during the final moments of the confrontation, spoke with a firmness Margaret had never heard from him before. "There will be no more lies in this house," he said, looking directly at his cousin. "Vivian, you will answer honestly for what you did, or Margaret's solicitor will make certain the truth comes out, regardless of what any of us prefer." Vivian's confidence finally broke entirely under the weight of Edmund's unwavering gaze, and in the confession that followed, delivered in halting, humiliated fragments, the full truth of the conspiracy against Margaret finally came into the light. Vivian had paid the servant to lie, hoping to remove Margaret from the household entirely, believing that with Margaret gone, and William too young to remember his true mother, she herself might eventually take Margaret's place at Edmund's side, securing at last the position she had wanted since childhood. Lady Constance, though she claimed ignorance of the specific bribery involved, admitted, with visible reluctance, that she had encouraged the accusation's swift acceptance without proper investigation, believing Margaret disposable the moment she had fulfilled her role in producing an heir. The confrontation, once fully unraveled, left the household in a state of quiet devastation, but for Margaret, it brought something she had not felt in 4 long years, a sense of justice finally within reach after being denied it so completely on the day of her removal. The weeks following Vivian's confession brought significant changes to Hartley Estate, changes that unfolded with the same careful precision Mr. Whitmore had used throughout the entire legal process. Vivian, facing the very real possibility of criminal charges for bribery and fraud, agreed to leave the estate entirely, relocating to a distant relative's household in the north, her reputation quietly but thoroughly ruined among the social circles that had once welcomed her so warmly. Lady Constance's influence over the household diminished considerably in the aftermath, her role reduced from commanding matriarch to a woman forced to acknowledge, publicly and privately, the harm her hasty judgment had caused. She did not become warm toward Margaret, not truly, old habits and old pride proving difficult to fully overcome, but she did, for the first time, treat Margaret with something approaching genuine respect, an acknowledgement, however grudging, of the strength Margaret had shown in rebuilding her life and returning to fight for her son. The formal legal proceedings, once initiated, moved more quickly than Margaret had expected, the weight of evidence Mr. Whitmore had gathered, leaving little room for the Hartley family's solicitors to mount a meaningful defense. The original annulment was overturned, the marriage's legal standing restored, and with it, Margaret's full legal rights, as William's mother and as Duchess of Hartley, rights she had been unjustly denied for 4 painful years. Duke Edmund, throughout this process, worked steadily to prove that his earlier remorse had not been merely words spoken in a moment of crisis. He gave Margaret full authority over decisions concerning William's care and education. He supported her, publicly and without hesitation, throughout the legal proceedings, even when doing so meant standing against his own mother's continued objections. He asked nothing of Margaret in return, no promise of renewed affection, no expectation that she would simply resume the role of wife, as though 4 years of separation and betrayal had never happened. "I do not expect you to forgive everything easily," he told her one evening, as they sat together in the garden, where William now played happily nearby, fully recovered and growing stronger each day. "I only hope, in time, you might allow me the chance to earn back even a small portion of the trust I failed to protect." Margaret considered his words carefully, watching William chase a small dog across the lawn, his laughter carrying easily through the evening air, a sound she had once feared she would never hear again. "I do not know what the future holds for us, Edmund," she said honestly. "I have built a life of my own now, one I am proud of, one I do not intend to abandon, simply because circumstances have changed here, but I am willing to let time answer the question of what remains possible between us, rather than deciding it in anger, the way this family once decided my fate, without ever truly hearing me." It was not a promise of reconciliation, not yet, but it was an opening, a door left carefully ajar rather than firmly closed, and for a man who had spent 4 years believing he had lost everything worth having through his own weakness, it was more grace than he had truly expected to receive. Margaret did not abandon her business in the city, choosing instead to divide her time between the shop she had built with her own hands and the estate where her son was slowly coming to know her, not as a story his grandmother had told him, but as the mother who had fought through fever and fear and 4 years of injustice to finally return to him. Grace, promoted at Margaret's insistence to a position of genuine trust within the household, remained one of Margaret's closest confidants. The loyalty she had shown throughout the darkest years finally rewarded with the security and respect she had long deserved. William grew, in the months that followed, into a bright, curious child who asked, occasionally, why his mother had been away for so long, questions Margaret answered honestly but gently, careful to protect him from unnecessary bitterness while never allowing the truth of what had been done to her to be softened into something it was not. Sometimes, she told him one evening, tucking him into bed in the nursery that no longer felt cold to her, people we trust make terrible mistakes, and it takes courage to admit those mistakes and try to do better. Your father made a mistake, William, but he is trying now, every day, to be someone worthy of your trust, and mine. William considered this with the serious concentration only a child can bring to such weighty matters. Do you forgive him? Margaret smiled, brushing his hair back from his forehead. I am learning to. Forgiveness is not something that happens all at once, my darling. It is something built slowly, the same way trust is built, one honest day at a time. A year after her return to Hartley Estate, Margaret stood once more in the garden where she had first begun, hesitantly, to hope this house might one day feel like home. William played nearby, taller now, steadier on his feet, laughing freely, in a way that no longer carried any shadow of the fear or confusion that had marked his early recovery. Duke Edmund stood beside her, no longer the distant, guarded man she had married 5 years earlier, but someone who had spent every day since her return proving, patiently and without demand, that he intended to be worthy of the family he had so nearly lost entirely through his own weakness. Margaret had not returned to this estate seeking forgiveness for anyone but her son. She had returned prepared to fight, to expose the truth, to reclaim what had been unjustly stolen from her, through lies and cowardice. What she found, in the end, was something she had not fully expected. Not simply justice, though justice had certainly been served, but the slow, careful possibility of a genuine family, built not on the cold transaction that had begun this story 5 years earlier, but on honesty, accountability, and the hard-won trust of a woman who had refused to let injustice have the final word over her life. She thought often, in quiet moments, of the frightened young bride who had first arrived at this estate in a dress that did not truly belong to her, uncertain of her place in a world that seemed determined to use her and discard her the moment her usefulness had ended. That young woman could not have imagined the strength she would eventually find within herself, the business she would build entirely on her own, the truth she would fight for and finally win, or the quiet, hard-earned peace she would eventually discover, standing in this same garden years later, watching her son grow up surrounded, at last, by people who genuinely loved him, herself most of all. Margaret had been cast aside once, dismissed, as though her worth ended the moment she had served her purpose, but she had returned, not as the woman they had discarded, but as someone entirely her own, someone strong enough to demand the truth, patient enough to rebuild what had been broken, and wise enough to know that the family she had ultimately built for herself, whatever shape it finally took, would always be one she had chosen freely, on her own terms, rather than one simply given to her by circumstance or birth. And in that quiet, hard-won freedom, she finally found something the Hartley estate had never truly offered her before her return. A home that was genuinely, completely her own. The peace Margaret found in that garden did not last without further testing, though the tests that came now were of a different kind entirely, quieter, subtler, and in some ways harder to navigate than the open cruelty she had already survived. Nearly 2 years after her return, a letter arrived at the estate from a distant branch of the Hartley family, a cousin named Mr. Sinclair Hartley, who had long believed himself next in line to inherit certain lands and titles should Edmund's marriage ever again fall into question. He had heard, through channels neither Margaret nor Edmund could fully trace, whispers about the annulment's reversal, and he saw in those whispers an opportunity to challenge the legitimacy of the restored marriage itself. hoping to reopen old wounds and unsettle William's claim as heir before the boy grew old enough to defend it himself. Margaret felt the old fear rise in her chest the moment Mr. Whitmore explained the nature of the challenge, a fear she recognized instantly. The same helpless dread she had felt standing in the drawing room 5 years earlier, while Lady Constance decided her fate, without ever truly hearing her side. But she was not the same woman who had once stood silent and frightened in that room. She had spent years learning to fight for herself with evidence, patience, and the quiet support of people who had proven, again and again, that they would stand beside her. "He has no real grounds," Mr. Whitmore assured her, spreading legal documents across the table in Margaret's own study, a room she had claimed for herself within the estate, filled with her own books and her own careful records rather than relics of Hartley history alone. The annulment was overturned through proper legal process, with full evidence presented and accepted by the court. Mr. Sinclair Hartley is gambling that fear and old scandal will do the work his weak legal argument cannot. "Then we will not give him fear to gamble with," Margaret said. She met the challenge directly, rather than retreating from it. She allowed Mr. Whitmore to make the full record of the original case public where necessary, the bribery, the false testimony, the confession Vivian had eventually given, ensuring that anyone who wished to question the legitimacy of her marriage would first have to reckon publicly with exactly how unjustly she had been treated the first time such questions were raised. She invited scrutiny rather than fearing it, understanding now, in a way she could not have understood as a young bride, that truth examined openly was far harder to twist than truth kept hidden and whispered about in private drawing rooms. Duke Edmund stood beside her through every step of the renewed challenge, testifying without hesitation to the full truth of his own earlier weakness and the wrong done to Margaret, a public accounting that cost him some pride among certain circles of society, but that he offered without complaint, understanding it as a debt long overdue. "I will not let my past failure become the excuse for a fresh injustice against you," he told her, the night before the matter was finally settled before the courts. "Whatever it costs me to say plainly what I once refused to say at all, I will pay it gladly, if it protects you and William." The challenge collapsed within weeks, Mr. Sinclair Hartley's claim dismissed so thoroughly that he did not attempt to appeal it, retreating instead into quiet irrelevance, another distant relative who had underestimated exactly how far Margaret had traveled from the frightened, powerless woman he had hoped to find waiting for him. With that final threat resolved, life at Hartley Estate settled, at last, into something Margaret had once feared she would never know within these walls: genuine steadiness. William grew tall and clever, dividing his affection easily between his parents and Grace, who remained a beloved fixture in his life long after her formal duties as a maid had given way to a more trusted position, managing much of the household's daily affairs. Margaret's shop in the city continued to thrive under the careful management of Mrs. Talbot's now-grown daughter, whom Margaret had trained personally and trusted completely, allowing Margaret the freedom to divide her time between her independent life in the city and her growing family at the estate, without ever fully surrendering the identity she had built for herself during the hardest years of her life. Her relationship with Edmund rebuilt itself slowly, exactly as she had told him it would, one honest day at a time, built not on the cold arrangement that had first brought them together, but on a partnership that had been tested by fire and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to remain standing. There were still difficult conversations between them in those early years, moments where old hurt resurfaced unexpectedly, an offhand comment from a guest recalling old gossip, a memory of the 4 lost years that could still bring sudden tears to Margaret's eyes, even amid genuine happiness. Edmund never grew impatient with these moments, understanding, with the humility of a man who had once nearly lost everything through his own weakness, that healing did not move on any convenient timeline, and that his role now was simply to remain steady, present, and honest, for as long as it took. Lady Constance, in her final years, grew quieter and, in her own guarded way, gentler toward Margaret, though the two women never became close in the manner of true friends. It was enough, Margaret decided, that Lady Constance eventually came to genuinely respect her, watching from the sidelines as Margaret managed the estate's affairs with a competence that even the old Dowager Duchess could not deny, and watching, too, as William grew into a young man who spoke of his mother not with the confusion of a child raised on lies, but with the clear, uncomplicated pride of a son who understood exactly how hard his mother had fought to remain part of his life. Years later, when William himself stood on the edge of his own adulthood, preparing to take on greater responsibility for the estate that would one day be his, Margaret told him the full story of those difficult early years, not to burden him with old bitterness, but because she believed, firmly, that he deserved to understand exactly what his mother had survived, and exactly what kind of strength had been required to bring their family back together. "I want you to remember," she told him, sitting together in the same garden where she had once watched him chase a small dog across the lawn as a recovering child, "that being cast aside is not the end of anyone's story, if you refuse to let it be. It only becomes the end if you stop fighting for the truth, and for the people you love." William, older now, thoughtful in the way his mother had raised him to be, nodded slowly. "You never stopped fighting." "No," Margaret said, smiling at the son she had once feared she might never hold again. "I never did, and I never will, for you, or for this family we built together, out of everything that once tried to destroy it." The Hartley estate that Margaret had first entered as a frightened, uncertain bride had, over the years, become something entirely different beneath her steady hand. No longer a house defined by cold transaction and quiet cruelty, but a true home, built patiently, honestly, and against every expectation, by a woman the world had once tried to discard, and who had returned instead to reclaim everything that was rightfully hers.